because your reputation precedes you, if I may say so. You know, you've been on the ramparts for a long, long time, young man. Yeah.
Yeah, I started out, I guess, in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Here I am.
Yeah, here we
And
still are.
unfortunately, dealing with a lot of the same issues.
Isn't it the truth? Doesn't it seem like deja vu all over again sometimes? Yeah. Well, welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure, really, truly a pleasure to welcome to the program Robert Scheer. And Robert Scheer will be, as I said to him, his reputation precedes him. We'll let him fill us in on that. Specifically today, we want to talk about a book that's out now, and it's called let me show you what it looks like in the bookstore. It's called The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. And this has been written, co-authored in a sense by, I think Christopher, your son, had a good hand in writing a good deal of it, but they've been involved in this. We're going to talk about this book and about the current state of affairs and so forth, but we can fill in some of his background. And Robert Scheer, welcome very much to Manhattan Network and to Conversations. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you.
All right.
Okay. Listen, we're going to talk about the book. That's what we're on about. We were at a great gathering last night with your son, and Mark Green was there and so forth. But I wonder maybe you could share some of your own background, if you could, because we got a whole hour. Maybe you could fill in some of your background back to the 60s, as you said, and so forth.
Why don't we go back to my birth?
Okay, go right back to the beginning of your conception.
No, because it's often left out. You know, where do you get your politics? Where do you get your ideas from? And I always feel it's sort of truncated, you know, somehow. And in my case, my politics were pretty much molded by what I saw as a kid. You know, my father was a German Protestant refugee from Germany, or not a refugee, I mean, an immigrant from Germany, and come over, and then had a whole German family on his side, and people had come over as recently as the 30s. And then my mother was a Lithuanian Jew, and she had left Russia after the revolution. She was, I guess, one of the few first Jewish dissidents. She belonged to a group called the Jewish Socialist Bund, and Lenin crushed it, so she came here, and both of them were garment workers, and you know, we lived up in the Bronx, and they were poor.
Oh, you were born in New York.
I was born in the Bronx,
okay.
Bronx Hospital. Anyway, the thing was, I was born in 1936, and so I was pretty conscious during the war. You know, wasn't that conscious during Depression, but my father lost his job the day I was born, so I was pretty aware that the first, 4 or 5 years there were pretty rough.
Yeah, indeed.
And have some vivid memories of that. But, so in terms of whether I'm going to be on the left or the right, that pretty much came out of that. We lived on welfare, had support, and stuff. My father was in the Works Project Administration, all that kind of thing.
A lot of good stuff got done there.
Yeah. It's amazing how many buildings and bridges and, Coy Tower.
Works of art, too.
You know what the example I use of that is when I'm speaking in Orange County, where I lived for 10 years among all these Republicans in Orange County, California. I just recently spoke there, and I said, you guys are always beating up on liberals and always beating up on government, but your pride and joy here is Newport Harbor, which was built as a WPA project by Franklin Roosevelt. And then your water was stolen for you by Edmund Brown, and other progressive governors who got you the water. Otherwise, you'd just be a desert here. And then they built the highways down here with government funds, and then they give you all those defense contracts.
Yes,
so
indeed.
And then when they went bankrupt in Orange County, I wrote about it as a failed socialist experiment. They didn't like that too much.
You told that to the group down there.
But my own childhood, I remember having to wrestle with these questions of patriotism and nationalism, because I had to figure out how did these people that I saw as kind of nice people, go to Yorkville, the Geiger Cafe, I recall, and have German food with my relatives and go fishing with out in City Island with my uncle and everything. But these Germans were in the pictures we saw in the newsreels in the movie theater and what you'd see on the signs, on the subway and everything. They were these monsters, which they truly were. They'd become monsters. And they were killing my mother's family, because they were Jewish, among killing a lot of other people too. And so there I am, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, trying to figure this all out. And it left me with a great deal of suspicion of appeals to patriotism and nationalism.
Yeah.
And I've always, as a writer and everything, there's no question in my mind, I've always been on guard against it.
The last refuge of the scoundrel? Was it Mencken?
Patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. But and you know what, Ambrose Bierce corrected that.
Oh, he did?
And said it's the first.
Oh, the first, okay.
I would say if I have a bias as a journalist, and I have been a journalist. I worked for Ramparts, but then I went to work for and I've written for a lot of magazines, but I went to work for the LA Times in 1976, and I was a national reporter for a long time, and then now I write a column that's based at the LA Times. But I'm not one of those journalists who denies that I have a bias. I certainly do. I mean, if I'm covering garment workers in Los Angeles, which I have written about, I'm a little sympathetic to them.
To the workers.
Yeah, well, my mother was a garment worker.
Yeah,
I know
right.
something about what kind of, and my father was, and so what you have to put up with, and I am, pretend to be pro-trade union if they're doing their job right, and I'm not contemptuous of people on welfare because I've seen a lot of, people that have been forced into dire straits or don't get the breaks in life or so forth. So, and then on these kind of questions that we're here to discuss, Iraq and Bush and before that Vietnam and so forth, I have been always suspicious of, militarism and patriotism and appeals to nationalism. They scare me. I've seen them all over the world. I see how the end, the argument the end justifies the means leads people from the left or the right down paths of madness, whether it's the old Soviet Union or it was Nazi Germany or what have you. So I guess that sort of colored my stance. And then, I went to school here in New York at City College. And ironically, I was in the same class as Colin Powell at City College.
Really?
I can't say he was a friend or anything, but I also grew up a couple of subway stations away from him. And actually, he wrote a very interesting autobiography about all the stuff that was done for us when we were living in New York in those days, and just before I went to City, the tuition was absolutely free. I don't know. I think it was free when I went, but there also were free textbooks.
That was the place uptown.
Yeah.
130.
The place uptown.
Yeah.
The best college in America for a long time.
It really
produced more Nobel Prize winners than any other college.
Yeah,
And, it was in Harlem.
Yeah.
Before Rockefeller started attacking the city colleges, it was they each had their own personality. Hunter, Brooklyn, CCNY. And that to me, I loved that institution. I still do. It's like the last institution I really believed in. Because there you got a break. You got to, even though I was working all the time, I was working in the post office, after school and everything. Yeah. But still, I mean, we had teachers up there. A guy named Stanley Feingold, I remember. Guys like that. I mean, they weren't making anything. Some of them didn't even have tenure, but they just were great teachers.
It was just a great vibe.
Well, I think vibe cheapens it, frankly.
I think
what there was a great sense of mission.
Mission. Okay.
Mission. That this was a place open to the poor, open to the immigrants. Hopefully, it's still that way. I've gone up the city a bunch of times, spoke at one of the branches just yesterday, and I'm not an opponent of open admissions that they tried because I think it was a noble experiment to try to make the school more accessible.
To everybody.
To everyone. And
that's a noble idea, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think there are better ways of doing it, like in California where we have a very strong community college system. Yeah. And then if you get a B average in your community college work, all of those credits transfer and you're automatically eligible for one of the UC systems.
California's a heck of a progressive education
system.
Except you got some troubles financially now.
They've now been gutting it, but still it's a very good education system. But anyway, so I went through that, and then I went to Berkeley, and then I went to Ramparts, and then I went into, journalism. And it's interesting, though. I mentioned Colin Powell, and in his book, he says, he was in Vietnam. And he said, I'd gone to Vietnam myself in 64, 65, and then in 70, as a journalist. And, no one cares about Vietnam. We drove the whole country crazy over Vietnam, and fought about 15 years. You can't get any news about Vietnam. And in fact, what we do now...
You mean now?
No, we won't even... I went there 6 years ago for Microsoft. I did a report. It's a damn interesting place. Yeah. But here was this country, McNamara, there's this new movie out, The Fog of War.
Yes, indeed.
McNamara says in that movie that 3.4 million people died, including 60,000 Americans. And it's like...
for a mistake.
Oh, yeah, for a mistake.
It was a mistake.
Yeah. and nobody even cares about how these people live now. You
well,
know,
I do.
I assume you do, but I'll tell you,
yeah.
if you pick up the newspaper, you'll find very little news about Vietnam. And you know, we banned their catfish. They have to call them something else. We don't like their shrimp coming in because we have protectionist farmers in Louisiana, Mississippi.
Raising the country.
Yeah. We could bomb them, kill millions of them, but no, you can't sell us your catfish. You know, and so there's a lot. My whole sense of having traveled around the world a lot, covered wars, covered a lot of stuff, is how fickle we are. We have the attention span of a flea.
You're talking about America particularly, or the human species?
No, I'd say America. I would say some other colonizers were a bit more responsible. I mean, at least the French, when they went into Indochina, didn't bother to learn some of the local languages. You know, the British did a little bit of and all that. You know, and the reason, I don't know. This book that we're here to talk about,
right.
The 5 Biggest Lies, British told back. You know,
the biggest lie.
And my son really did most of the writing on
right.
this. And he said something interesting on this panel we had. He said, you know, I didn't want to write this book.
That's right.
It's not what I want to be writing about.
I want to deal with my 4-year-old kid.
I want to write fiction, and I want to write other stuff.
Leaders taking the lead.
Yeah, you know, and I feel the same way. You know, it's like I teach at USC. I teach in college. I have lots. You know, I had dyslexia. I have dyslexia, so I'm very interested in learning disabilities and so forth. There are a lot of things that I'd rather write about and talk about and so forth. And it seems to me I've spent my whole life with my finger in the dike, you know, preventing these disasters. You know, whether
there's so many.
Finger
here, and you use your toe over there.
So the books that I've written about, you know, like nuclear war, you know, trying to call attention, you can't win them, and you know, or wrote a book about it's not necessary to go invade Cuba, or you know, write about Vietnam. I wrote a lot about, and now about Iraq. You know, it's all really writing about unnecessary, dangerous mischief that is done when adults aren't watching a store, and when people are being just irresponsible, absolutely irresponsible. And what happened here with Iraq is just the worst case that I've come across. I mean,
this is worse than Vietnam.
Oh, damn yes!
In its potential.
Not just its potential.
You're going to have to go pretty far to get 3.4 million.
Yeah, but you know,
in terms of the quantitative
measurement,
delivered down by a mistake.
And as McNamara pointed out, we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than we did in all of World War II on Europe.
Napalm, remember napalm? Kids and women, and you know, and we did that. And wasn't that terrorist? Is that? How do you differentiate between?
I think it's terrorist,
but
let me just say something why I think this is the most egregious. Okay, because what happened with what happened with Vietnam is the lying was like these little lies and kind of slipping into it. So first you had Kennedy saying we have flood control advisors and we're going to back this Democratic guy Diem, and you know, we're going to do this sort of stuff, and it was quite gradual, you know, and then you know we're going to ignore the Geneva Accord. I don't want take you all through the whole history of it, but you know, even the Gulf of Tonkin, well, there was the first attack and not the second attack, and you know, and it just kept building the lie.
Were you against it from the get-go?
Oh yeah,
from the get-go.
Yeah, well, I'd gone there. I went there in '63 the first time, and I saw this was ridiculous. What are you talking about? Domino theory. First of all, if you knew anything about the history of the area, you know that the basis of the whole war was absurd, which is somehow, if the communists succeed in Vietnam, then they're going to conquer San Diego or some dominoes will fall. Well, the fact is, there had already been a Sino-Soviet dispute. There was not an international communist movement. Chinese communists, China had occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years, so you could have predicted exactly what happened. When we were defeated in Vietnam, what happened? The Chinese and the Vietnamese went to war over their border. They didn't go conquer Thailand or something, you know. And,
but you had that Kennan article, that containment, you had that whole thing that informed geostrategic thinking that...
Well, it was all wrong. If, you know,
think it was,
I hate to be dogmatic, sound dogmatic, but
but that went back to 19th century notions of geostrategic sea power and land power.
I understand all that, but what I'm saying is, if anybody bothered to really be thinking about that, you know, they know, for instance, in the Chinese Revolution, that we backed Chiang Kai-shek less than we backed Mao Zedong. Okay, and I'm talking about 1927, 28. We had a lot more sympathy, and the Russians backed Chiang Kai-shek more than Mao Zedong. And during the war, you know, Mao, just like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, were kind of our allies against the Japanese. And, you know, so the politics are very confusing. I mean, the Soviets were not big backers of the Chinese Communist Revolution. They're very threatened by it. it's all in Khrushchev's memoirs and elsewhere. I'm not telling you anything brand new here, but you know, this whole notion of an international communist conspiracy and a timetable to take over the world, which all little kids were raised on, was nonsense.
Who lost China?
Yeah, communist movements were highly nationalistic, and because they were nationalistic, they would be at each other's throats no matter what. So the Sino-Soviet dispute really started very early, and it preceded the Cuban Revolution, it preceded our involvement in Vietnam. And so the whole war was based on this. However, there was this sort of, as I say, gradual moving into this quagmire. You know, well, we're there, we can't just get out. And maybe our intentions weren't so bad at first, and then they get worse, you know. So if you look at the history of the Vietnam War, it's much more of again, the gradual development or going into a quagmire.
But it wasn't.
But wait a second.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
Let me just say.
All right, good. Make the point.
Let me make the point here.
Right.
Something happened here that I think is the most egregious thing to happen in American history, because we had a sudden, shocking event. Okay, it would be like, and I'm talking about the attack on the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. Okay, now it would be like after Pearl Harbor, if we waged war on Switzerland or something, or we went to conquer Brazil or something. I mean, what this president Bush did was he took the fear, the anxiety over this attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and instead of analyzing it logically for the people, okay, explaining what it's all about, he's never even wanted an investigative commission. He's never really wanted to analyze it. You know, if you suddenly had a bump on your forehead, we'd want to biopsy it. We'd want to analyze it. We'd want to think about it. We wouldn't say, well, let's cut off his ankle.
You think it's that egregious? It
is more egregious. They knew there was no connection between Hussein and Al-Qaeda. They knew they were talking about two different kinds of movements. One was this old Arab nationalism. One was this religious fundamentalism.
Well, Pan-Arabism. Yeah, that Ba'athist Party was Pan-Arabism. Everybody thought it went with Abdel Nasser, but
no.
The Ba'athists were Pan-Arab.
And it's still there. Yeah. It's still the tension between Hamas and Arafat. I mean, you still have basically your broad Pan-Arab movements that are secular. I'm not saying they're wonderful movements, but
Saddam was secular.
But they're secular.
He was secular and progressive.
Right. Well,
in some people's minds.
Well, he was certainly.
They were about ready to be declared a first world nation.
Well, he was secular as far as more secular as far as the rights of women and so forth. But which is not unimportant. But what I'm trying to get at here is that at that September 11th, this president took that emotion and instead of saying, okay, let's deal with this religious fundamentalism. Let's deal with its roots in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Let's talk about what we know. 15 of the hijackers are from Saudi Arabia, okay? The money went from Saudi Arabia, went from Pakistan. The Pakistan secret police were in charge of a lot of these Taliban development. A lot of it had to do with these are monsters of our creation. We said these people were freedom fighters. We used them against the Soviets.
Absolutely.
And so forth. Okay.
79.
So instead of dealing with this mess of the Taliban, okay, and Al-Qaeda, we then bring up this old saw of Iraq, which had nothing to do with it, and we say, well, let's go to war with them. You know, they're all part of terror. They're all part. Well, they weren't. You know, they were very different problems. The fact is that Saddam Hussein was a defanged ruler, that we were bombing merrily at anything we saw looked suspicious. There had been extensive UN supervision, as we know now, had destroyed his weaponry.
1,500,000 people were killed, including 500,000 children with the sanctions, according to UN reports.
But I'm saying what get down to this egregious lie is for this shell game to be played, to say, okay, let's take all this anger and fear over that terrorism, and let's direct it against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and then go invade the second biggest oil supply in the world in the name of liberating it. I don't think we've ever had that big a lie put over to the American people.
Okay.
And then to buttress it by saying we have to go there because this guy has got these weapons of mass destruction that they can deliver. We can have a mushroom cloud over New York. All that language. We have never been lied to that degree. And why that is
so bold-faced.
So bold-faced. But what is truly shocking about it is that we did this in the eyes of the world, where we have been proclaiming we got a great system here. We got checks and balances. We got a free press. You know, we have an enlightened citizenry.
True, it's a pretty good system.
And then for the whole world, what does it say? None of it worked.
No.
Congress did not provide a check and balance. You know, the media went along. The public got cowed and afraid. Not everybody. We had big peace demonstrations. There were some people spoke
February 15th this year, yeah.
But not enough. You know?
Not enough.
And so I would say that there's never been a time when we so failed our heritage, when we so failed to act as free people as during this period.
Okay, that's a big statement. That's a big statement. I wonder if we could back up a little bit to the Vietnam thing. We could, because I would say that the Vietnam thing at the level of the leadership, and we're talking about a failure of leadership in a sense, was informed by this geostrategic thinking that had gone back for a long time. This idea, Mr. Kennan's X article in 1947, that we had to contain this amoeba coming out from the Eurasian landmass. There was a geostrategic pattern that informed that in terms of the decisions, even though we got into it slowly. I don't know if it was an extension in Korea and so forth.
It's a little more complicated.
But to jump from...
let's stop right there.
All right,
it's a little more complicated. You know, there were plenty of people of influence in this country who thought it was stupid to get involved with Vietnam.
Mr. Eisenhower.
Okay. After all, the French had been the colonialists there. Even though we paid for 80% of the war between 50 and 54, they were defeated. Eisenhower said in his memoirs that if there had been an election, 80% of people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. There were plenty of people in the American establishment, and I think Kennan already was in that, was not for going to war. There were plenty of people who said, look, this is not the big battleground with communism over the Cold War, and this is a mistake. And on the other hand, you had some people who are very similar to the neoconservatives now.
That's what I wanted to get at. Yeah.
Very similar to the neoconservatives now, who formed kind of a Vietnam lobby and said, no, this is the test of our courage and this is a test of our resolve. They were able to get Kennedy to get more involved than he should have been. And one of the ridiculous things that happened is we put a Catholic in power in a country where the Catholics only represented 10% of the people. No Din Diem. We found him in a monastery, in Marino Monastery in New Jersey, and trucked him, flew him out there, and designed a government around him and so forth. But still, there was this fantasy, if you like, we're helping to bring democracy, and we're going to work it out so it's better than communism and show a different model. And then they kept moving deeper and deeper. Okay, now we're here. Then Diem gets assassinated. What do we do now? We got some new general. Do we back him? Do we just cut and run? Those became the arguments. And by the time even Nixon came along, there were very few people who actually defended the war. Nixon, after all, had a plan.
Cambodia.
Well, Nixon had a plan.
Cambodia.
Yeah, but Nixon had a plan to get out of Vietnam. Okay, that's how he got elected.
7 years.
Well, yeah, but that's how he got elected. So as opposed to now, where you still have Bush getting on Meet the Press or something and defending this war.
Did yesterday.
You had very few people who out and out would defend. They said, well, we're there. We got in there. And I think that's what's going to happen with Iraq, by the way. We're going to be there 10, 15 years from now.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get at. And I understand how we got into that quagmire in Vietnam, but I do think that there was a history, and I would say it goes back to the 19th century, in thinking of geostrategic pattern to try to get some sort of an understanding of the evolution of international affairs, and that can inform the things. Maybe it can inform them to where they make mistakes. And what is it, if there is such a thing, a geostrategic, large, grand plan that's in the minds of people who think in terms of the international leadership and so on, what is there in terms of something comparable to that, which Kennan's containment theory or something, that informs this that we're coming into now? What is the grand strategy, do you think, that's behind that, if you want to call it the neocon or whatever it is, that's gotten into this frame of mind and into this quagmire we're maybe coming into? Is there a large scheme or a large long-range thinking that has brought us to this sorry position as you see it, and yet is being proclaimed so bold-facedly by our current leadership?
Well, first of all, even when Kennan, I don't know how many of you viewers know who Kennan was or anything.
George Kennan.
But, at the start of the Cold War, he defended it by necessity of a policy of containment, which was based on a very simplistic view of this communist enemy, and as I said, did not anticipate things like the Sino-Soviet dispute and all this other stuff.
It was geostrategic. They had this, whoever controls the heartland or controls the North European plain controls the heartland. And
Well,
you
yeah,
controls the heartland, controls the world island, and you controls the world island informs the world.
I understand
And so the
that.
arraignment of British sea power against land power and that sort of thing. So these people who think that way had a large scheme that they were geopolitics or geostrategic thinking.
They did.
You know,
And
do they have such
And
now?
that
What
certainly
is it?
was carried on later by people like Kissinger and others
Yeah,
in the grand
yeah.
schemes. I'm not denying that. What
Yeah.
I am saying is it was more of a debate than you're suggesting. And these
Yeah.
ideas were more open to debate, and there were
Okay.
different, even within the State Department, even within branches of the government, there were arguments about that. There were people who were more concerned about arms control and more concerned. For instance, even
Yeah.
Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was in, he invited Khrushchev to the United States. He tried to break the dynamic of the Cold War. He had people in his administration who were more hawkish and more dovish, but there was dialogue. And when Eisenhower left office and gave his warning about the military-industrial complex,
Yes.
it was a warning about exactly what's happening now, where we're
Yeah.
using this war on terror to beef up this whole military apparatus.
Uh-huh.
So what I'm suggesting, and is that right now we have our foreign policy has been captured by, for the first time, I think,
Okay.
by a narrow band of ideologues that in any neocons
Uh-huh.
that in any other administration would have been a faction.
Yes, right. I
Would have been
understand.
a
And they
wing.
have been a
Yeah,
faction
yeah,
for
they've
quite a
been
while,
around
out in the wilderness.
Richard Pearl was
Yeah.
who
Wolfowitz.
criticized
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan after he met with Gorbachev and started this movement towards a more peaceful world.
Yeah.
It was Pearl who was out there in the hallway at the Reykjavik saying, "No, you're selling out the
Yeah,
American
yeah.
people."
You've known him quite a while, personally.
Yeah,
Pearl,
Pearl I've known since he worked for Scoop Jackson back in the, I guess it was in the 60s
Yeah.
through the 70s. But my point is that right now, and if you see a movie called Uncovered, it's a documentary.
Yes, I've seen it.
Okay,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
know there are like 23
Experts.
Cold War veterans of the
Right.
intelligence
Yeah.
who have gone on record as saying these guys are betraying our security. They're, simplifying beyond recognition what this world looks like. They don't know what they're doing. They're out of control, and so forth. So I would say something different has happened under George W. Bush than even happened under his fathers,
Yeah.
or happened
Yeah.
under, for instance, if you go
Yeah,
back to
yeah.
Jimmy Carter, you had a hawk like Zbigniew Brzezinski, but you also had Cy Vance.
Yeah.
It was more dovish, and there was debate, and push in one direction or the other. That has not happened this administration. Colin Powell, who should represent that force of a more reasonable point of view, has been silenced.
It seems that way.
He's a captive. He's an absolute captive. They
yeah.
send him up there to lie at the UN, and for the life of me, I can understand how a man could keep his pride in that situation and not resign. Not resign.
Yeah, that's a hard call.
Well, just
people
even
in those positions
even just the other day, he said they asked him, Colin Powell, would you have been in favor of going to war against Iraq if you knew they didn't have these weapons? And he said something like, probably not. And boom, 2 days later, the White House they lowered a boom on him, and he came out and changed his position. So what I'm saying is that...
Well, if he comes out too strongly, he's likely to be out in the cold.
Yeah,
Is
but
that one of the marks
even
of
during
power
the
or-
Vietnam War,
Yeah.
there were people in Johnson's administration. There were people in Nixon's administration. I mean, Moynihan, for instance, he was on the domestic side, but there were certainly plenty of people in the Johnson and Kennedy and Nixon administration who had their reservations about the war, who expressed them, and so forth. What you have here with George W. Bush is uniformity, as if there's some kind of communist Leninist party or something.
Yeah. It's like that. It does seem like that. Yeah, like a Bolshevik takeover.
They've got
something,
their narrow ideology,
Uh-huh.
and if you don't agree with them, then you're something close to a
you're
traitor.
unpatriotic.
You're something close to a
Yeah,
traitor.
they're
And then
prodding
they've
that
got
out.
these jackals on talk radio who beat that message into everybody, and they'll smear anyone. I mean, look what they did to Howard Dean, for God's sake. I mean, the man was a moderate governor. He said some reasonable things about the Iraq War, had the guts to say some clear and reasonable things about it not making any sense. And when it looked like he might get ahead and be the candidate, they just went after him.
You think he didn't implode himself, you think, or you
Look,
think it was
we all have
think it was a
failings.
conspiracy? Or that's
We
a-
all have
that's a wrong
failings.
term?
It's a question of whether the media, wants to exploit those failings to destroy the man. And, my God, you know, Bush has said some pretty stupid things. If you want to pick on his language, you want to pick on him, you could. But people don't. They give him the benefit of the doubt. He mispronounces words.
It seems that way to me. He just gets a pass after pass after pass, and the Congress votes $87 billion already.
Ronald Reagan said a lot of stupid, misinformed things, and people gave him a pass. And so what did Howard Dean do? He got a little bit strident there in front of his campaign workers, and wanted to cheer him on and don't be demoralized. And it made it sound like the guy was, the most dangerous guy.
He just went over the top a little bit, like singing at a Rathskeller one night or something. I mean, it's no big deal, like that. But they can use that. They can use it.
Well, that's what bothers me, because it was the character assassination against Dean, I think, is very troubling.
Because he was trying to get a people's thing going?
Well,
maybe
first of all,
if I may, let me ask you, Robert. If you're talking about Colin Powell, the difficulty it is, if you're in a group that has power, and let's just say extend that a little bit by say you've got a Republican party, you've got a Democrat, you're in the Congress, you're in the Senate, you're in a situation where you're able to wield real power and so forth, it's probably very difficult to come out too strongly. Like Mr. Colin Powell can't come out and criticize the thing very vociferously or talk truth to power without being ousted from that ability to where down the line you're going to have power.
Okay.
So there is this problem that there...
No.
Okay.
Look at this. Colin Powell knows that he was sent up to the UN to tell lies. Now, if he knew it at the time, he should have resigned then.
Wait a minute, that's easy for you and I to say, but for somebody who's in that position who said, our day will come. So the Democrats giving all kinds of passes to Mr. Bush, saying, our day will come within the system, is what I'm saying. And Mr. Dean's opening something that's going to bring in a whole lot of people that have been turned off by the system itself, is what I'm saying.
We're not talking about whether we're changing the water rates in Omaha or whether we're going to set up another weather balloon.
I agree with you,
We're talking about going to war.
Yeah, I'm in.
We're talking about lying our way into war. And we're talking about, the ends justifying the means, and we don't even know what these ends are anymore.
That's what I was trying to get at.
We don't know if we're going to be bogged down in Iraq and the Mideast, for a century.
What do you think is behind it?
And stupidity and arrogance. And,
same old...
think of the arrogance. We supposedly have 5 people in the State Department who know classical Arabic. I read this in the New York Times the other day.
That many, huh?
We're talking about a region of the world that is incredibly complex, and we haven't done our homework. We don't respect their religion, their different religions. We don't really respect their culture, and we're going to go now and tell them how to build schools and how to build democracy. It's utter nonsense. The first claim that was made was this was going to be good for Israel. This has been a disaster for Israel.
You think it has been a disaster for Israel? Because a lot of those neocon people were pretty right-wing Likudnik people, aren't they? Isn't Sharon part of that neocon coalition or not? It seems to me it goes back to the 70s.
It may be, but my answer to that is with friends like that, you don't need enemies.
Yeah, right.
Anybody who thinks stirring the pot of the Mideast and getting everybody all riled up about religious differences and threatening to take their oil and humiliation of, we're going to run, we're going to heavily armed guys are going to run your society and tell you how to have democracy.
Full spectrum dominance of the whole bloody world.
Anybody thinks that's going to make the Mideast a more peaceful region, that's screwy. Absolutely screwy. And anybody thinks that's going to help a peace process in which you're trying to get the Palestinians and the Israelis to live in the same area peacefully, it's backfired.
Remember Barack talking about we're going to break bones? We're going to smash this. We're going to smash. It's for strength or peace through strength. We're going to break the back of this resistance of people who just won't listen to reason, our reason. That sort of attitude in the world that is sort of in a sense being manifest. That if you coddle these people, spare the rod, spoil the child. That kind of an attitude toward the world seems to be manifest through this peace through strength initiative on the part of the administration. And it's not only Islam, if I may suggest, it's the movement that went on in February 15th. There's anti-globalization movement that's going and informing things all over the world. And, there's criticism of the whole structure of the world system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Argentina's falling apart.
You're getting a little ahead of me.
Well, I'm just saying it's not just Islamic, although we're talking about it in this book. You're right.
I mean, I got to focus on...
Okay.
It's not that I want to sell books, which I do want to sell.
We sure, why not? Let them know.
But
Good
by the
book
way,
out, let them know.
let me just say, I don't get any royalties from this.
You're not getting any royalties
No,
at
this
all?
was done for a
Okay.
non-for-profit. I pay my own way. I'm here paying my own way. I pay
Good.
my own hotel bills and so forth.
Good
So
deal.
I'm doing it because I think it's useful.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of things I'd rather be doing, even though you're a very good company.
Well, it's good company with you,
all right.
too.
But the fact
and
that
you say you think
I
we're
don't
the
want to
deepest
get
doo-doo we've ever been in.
That's
over
right.
this
And I don't.
I agree with
I
you.
don't want to let you detract from the point I'm
Okay,
making,
gotcha. Okay.
which is first of all, not all lies are created equal. Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Orwell.
When you lie about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, for example, weapons of mass destruction, you're not kidding around. This is a serious worldwide problem. How do we control these weapons? So for Senator Joe Lieberman to say, well, I'm not worried that we didn't find weapons of mass destruction because Saddam Hussein himself was a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah. Now that's really something.
When I read that, I thought, you know, how dangerously stupid is this man? How can you use language in this way? Saddam Hussein is a weapon of mass. Does that mean if you plunk him down in a hole in Manhattan and light him on fire, Manhattan will be destroyed and radiation will be everywhere and people, skin will peel off their bones?
Poetic license?
Well, I mean, but it's such a dangerous notion.
No, I understand.
Instead of saying, look, there are these weapons that are unique.
Absolutely. Tell me about it.
And we have to worry about
We can destroy the species.
That's right.
That's true. That's still a fact. Mr. Jonathan Schell has reminded us of this over the years, that we can destroy the whole species with the weapons that exist.
What do you mean it's still true? It's more true.
More true than it was in 1980?
Yeah, of course, because the weapons are there. They're more dangerous. They're more powerful. We haven't stopped building weapons. And they're less under control. Less under control, and there are plenty of scientists and others circling the world who don't make a living because we didn't worry about that. And there's material. So it's much more dangerous now than it's ever been because it's not under control.
For 1 second.
And so let me just say, to play light with that, and one of our 5 lies is the lie that he had weapons, that he had nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And that he had the ability to make it, which was a big lie, and there was never any evidence for that. Then you instead of focusing, say, on Pakistan, which does have nuclear weapons, and what we did right after September 11th, even though Pakistan had been behind the Taliban, had financed these people, had helped them, and helped Al-Qaeda, we ended the sanctions on Pakistan. Now we discover, in recent weeks, Pakistan is the one who nurtured the nuclear capability of North Korea and Iran and Libya. And so are we going to go to war with Pakistan? So we have this diversion of the issue of weapons of mass destruction. First of all, we lump them all together. They shouldn't be lumped.
They shouldn't be, nor should they be lumped together where Mr. Bush in his press conference said, well, they had the capacity. We've had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction since the special theory of relativity in 1905.
Exactly.
And that's a very careful distinction between saying they've got the capacity to do it and you're going to do preemptively.
He was definitely being
that's a very dangerous
He was definitely being a demagogue
and
about
if I may, Robert, if I may, 200,000 years, they tell us now, Homo sapiens been here. We've been 10,000 generations. You and I were born about the same time, and at the end of the Second World War, even though we have all this capability of extended consciousness that is technology and so forth, we were still, in a certain sense, looking at the big picture, evolution of events cosmically and so forth. We were protected in our own impotence from being able to have the capacity to destroy the whole species. We could destroy this village in the other cave, we could get the other, that kind of thing. But somewhere between the end of the Second World War and now, as you and I sit and talk, we've developed a capability where, as Jonathan Schell showed in that Fate of the Earth, where he looked at a couple chapters where he talked about, it's not just the end of them. It's not just the end of, that kind of tit-for-tat kind of thing we've been doing throughout history. It's the end of the species. That's a major existential event.
Well, if you want to...
And one wonders if...
If you want to put it in some perspective...
Let me just finish, if I may, on that. That's an event. That's a destructive potential. Now, one wonders if you take the adverse side of a destructive scenario, we're writing scenarios here about capacity, the term of capacity. We have a capability equally monumental in a certain sense of making the world work for everybody in a way that historically we simply have not had. We've developed a capability to feed, clothe, take care of everyone in this world that simply was not there historically. We crossed some sort of a line. Bucky Fuller pointed out. He did that in his World Game. And he set out a kind of intelligence agency that took all these factors, demographic capability, into account, and that there might have been some sort of a transformative capability of the collective human spirit and so forth that is equally part of the capability we have to destroy ourselves. And they don't seem to be only getting at the reading of the comprehensive capability we have technologically augmented in order to, in terms of the drawing upon the intelligence that we had. This book is published by a group called the Akashic Record. They got the whole record there. But they're only selectively selecting things in order to put forth a certain kind of an ideology. But just as dire as the consequence that we're in now, existentially, in terms of the evolution of consciousness or universal development.
What were you just saying about Akashic?
Akashic Record is the publisher of the book, and so they say in the metaphysical thinking that nothing is lost, that sort of thing. So we have an intelligence.
That's what Akashic means?
Yeah, Akashic.
I didn't know. I like these. I like these guys a lot. That's Akashic Books and Seven Stories Press.
Yeah, Seven Stories Press. Yeah,
but that's where the Akashic comes from.
Akashic Record is a metaphysical term that nothing is ever forgotten or lost in terms of metaphysical development.
Well, you learned something there.
But
can I just say something? You're a great big picture guy, so
yeah,
I don't want to lose it.
Because we're.
I don't want to. I know, but I want to bring it down for viewers.
Okay, I had my little say. Go ahead, bring it back to earth. Yeah.
I'll bring it back to earth. I think your point was very valid. I think the destruction of the human species is very much.
And the possibility of World Game looking positively beyond the leadership tunnel vision, driving into the future in the rearview mirror, looking in the rearview mirror, that our current leadership
and in
is
fact,
adapting.
you saw some of that in what happened in Iraq, because the UN was acting as a responsible social agency, the UN Security Council.
We created it.
And it was acting in a pro-human way of trying to get rid of weapons and yet at the same time help people eat better and have better drinking water and so forth. So you could actually take the UN in Iraq as kind of a model of where we wanted to go, and they were doing their job on both counts very effectively, the UN Food for Peace programs and so forth, and the UN Search for Weapons of Mass Destruction. Both were being done very effectively. Our president, George W. Bush, smashed it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Smashed it. So that's the whole problem, that militarism in this case trumped this international effort. But I do want to get back to the nuclear weapons.
Okay, you have to do it.
It's possible.
No questions bigger.
But I think we've always dealt with it in a way as a too big question. And I've also written on the subject. Yeah. And I think I've gone to many conferences where they've talked about throw weights and arms control and so forth. And, in fact, I wrote a book once called Thinking Tuna Fish, Talking Death, and my whole point there was I'd gone to a conference at the Livermore Labs where everybody talked about how many hundreds of millions would die in this kind of attack, that kind of attack, and then we broke for lunch, and all they really were concerned about is what they were going to get for lunch. Was it going to be the tuna fish again, or was it going to be steak or something?
You titled the book that?
Yeah, Thinking Tuna Fish, Talking Death.
That's great, yeah,
right. But in terms of what happened on September 11th, to take it down
a few
notches here, okay, if a primitive nuclear device had been smuggled in say, bales of marijuana through Mexico, say a device of the power of what we dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the Fat Man, Little Boy, bombs, primitive atomic weapons, there wouldn't be a Manhattan. It was not two towers. Well, I think that's something people have got to focus on. There wouldn't have been a Manhattan, and that could have very easily happened. So when this president putzes around about they have this or they're going to give this or that, and you play around with this issue of proliferation, what we're trying to do is prevent that kind of disaster. You don't make light of it. You don't use it for partisan political purposes. You don't lie about it. You don't excuse your friends in Pakistan who have the capacity to do that and are doing it, and then focus on this guy in Iraq who you don't like, who doesn't have the capacity, because you're dealing with okay, even if we're not at that moment talking about the extermination of the whole human race, we are at the very least talking about the elimination of, say, Manhattan. Okay?
Not a small matter.
Now, what would have happened if Manhattan had been eliminated? Okay, radiation, people could not move in Manhattan, you couldn't account for the dead, the hospitals could not have handled all the radiation illness and everything, what would the rest of the country be like? It wouldn't be a free society
The rest
anymore.
of the world, yeah.
The country
Yeah,
wouldn't be a free society anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be having this discussion. Well,
Yeah,
we wouldn't
right.
even be here in Manhattan. But people in California wouldn't be having this discussion,
No,
you know.
right.
That we would have martial law,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because, look, we overreacted so much to the World Trade Center with the Patriot Act and all the infringements on civil liberties
Still
and so forth.
going. It's still a threat.
That if, in fact, you had had this, elimination of Manhattan and not a couple of buildings in Manhattan,
Mm-hmm.
big as they may be,
Yeah, mhm.
I suspect this country would have been so traumatized and our leadership would have been so despotic
Mm-hmm.
and irrational,
Mhm.
as they have been already,
Mhm.
that we would no longer be a free society.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, that's the fear. We had a conference here just the other day. Mr. Gore talked to, and that they had fear, the use and abuse in politics.
Right.
And that's the fear that Bobby Dylan said something was blowing in the wind back in 1960s. It's blowing in the wind. And isn't that what Mr. Bush is building upon? That existential fear that is going to be there at a certain level, and that he's building on this, and that he's going to go out by God and make sure that he's going to protect us from the folly of our.
Well, that is the big theme.
That's
again, if I get back to our book, that
Okay,
is that is the big theme of our book. You
Mhm.
see, this book is basically, I should hold it up.
Mhm.
It's really a case study in the language of lying,
Mhm.
and
Lying,
how
okay.
language of lying and how this administration has done it. And basic to it is this irrational force of fear.
Is it irrational when you can destroy New York City or you can destroy the
No,
species?
but what I'm saying is,
we don't want to ignore that fact that exists.
No, but instead of, it's like I said, if you had a bump on your forehead,
Yeah.
we would analyze it, be scientific about it, be logical, try to figure out if you're going to die from that, or is there something can we do? Should we remove it? Should we biopsy it? Should we? Okay, but we would not. You would not want your doctor to be overwhelmed with panic.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't want the patient to be overwhelmed with fear,
Mhm.
because some logical choices are going to have to be made here.
Right.
And what I'm saying is here, the reason they got away with their lies, the reason, if you just saw it when he was on Meet the Press,
Yeah.
what he can do is push that fear button
That's what
to
I
make us irrational,
Mhm.
okay? Because if you get overly, frightened, you're not going to think straight, okay? And so instead of, he didn't want a 9/11 commission. He didn't want our experts to think about how did this happen? What was the role of the Saudis? What was the role of Pakistan? How did these people get in? Why did the FBI and the CIA talk to each other? How could it have been avoided? Was it a question of having some locks on the airport? Was it a question of, maybe having sky marshals? We don't even know what we're doing now. If you buy a round trip ticket, you don't get searched. You buy a one-way ticket, you get searched or examined. Okay, so what is that based on? That terrorists? Have we done a scientific study that shows that suicidal terrorists that are willing to blow themselves up want to save money on their airplane ticket?
Yeah.
It's nuts. Okay, it's absolutely nuts.
Yeah. So it's bad pattern recognition.
Right. So we have not, and that's what I meant about fear. I'm not saying that all fear is illegitimate.
Mhm.
What I've said is that he has used fear as a weapon to create irrationality. And,
a lot of despots have, haven't they?
Yeah. And the reason this pattern of lying, which we've tried to analyze.
Yeah.
It's
very well, incidentally.
And it's very cleverly done.
Mhm.
He's right. He never said, specifically said, Saddam Hussein blew up the World Trade Center. Okay.
But he sure got 70% of the people
he
thinking.
He got 70% thinking by always making, even in his Meet the Press thing, he even got it in there.
Just yesterday. Yeah, still persisting.
He even got it in there,
And it got resonance.
It's a worldwide terror. And they did this terror here, and this guy did this terror here, and terror.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing you know, Saddam Hussein was somehow behind the World Trade Center when he wasn't.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we can't analyze how did the World Trade Center happen? What can we do to avoid it? Did going to Iraq make us safer? Wesley Clark, who is certainly, a good military man, has made a very serious charge that this has weakened us in the war on terrorism. It's created an irrationality.
Nor, if I may, nor have we gone to the other side of where you were talking about the cutting back on all the potentialities about what really creates a state of terror has to do with, let's just say at an elemental level, is the allowing of our capability to provide for humanity within an ecological context and so forth, which is there before us. We have the capability and but we don't have a political and economic system that lets us do what we're collectively capable of doing in terms of the operation of what Bucky Fuller called the spaceship Earth, and we don't address ourselves to the causes of the animosity
I think
that what might be along the lines of opening on that there is a rosier scenario other than this to the death kind of fight between people who are claiming that they have good against the evil which is over there somewhere.
Yeah,
Do you understand? There's not a positive turn of mind on the planet. Let me just say one thing quick, if I may, in support of Bucky Fuller. The Supreme Court...
Is he running for president?
No, he's not running. He died in 1983. But the United States Postal Office has just told us that they're going to give us a stamp in about April or June of this year with Bucky's presence on the stamp. And I think we would do well, particularly a lot of the youth, perhaps, might be able to turn to some of Bucky Fuller's comprehensive musings back in the 60s and so forth, and also to this concept he had of the world game, where they took resources and so forth into a comprehensive context, not one that's specially directed at what the CIA or something wants to do.
Lunch companion, too. I ate with him on Rico's and other places in San Francisco.
It's a positive, alternative positive scenario on a large scale that might be there before us, and maybe the youth could get a hold of, or the people that are on the peace side of things could get a hold of that more than we have, rather than stressing the negative that's being manifest so manifestly by the current United States administration in the minds of many, is what I'm saying. There's a positive, here comes the sun kind of possibility, perhaps, that's coming.
But let me just suggest again.
Okay.
Perhaps simpler or a more immediate way to think about it.
Okay.
And I think what Bush has done is floated this war metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as they did with the war on drugs, as they did now with terror. Mm-hmm. And rather than a medical metaphor, terror is an illness.
Yeah.
And just as, drug addiction. Mm-hmm. And for somebody like this Palestinian woman who had a law degree, had everything to live for, strap some explosives around her, blow up a cafe of people trying to eat dinner.
Happening around the world, up in Chechnya, Moscow, all over the world now.
So
people are going to that extreme.
When you have to try to figure out why someone does that.
Yeah. Well, it could be schizophrenia.
Well, but it's coming out of a whole large group of people. So you have to ask yourself, well, schizophrenia would be one medical explanation.
Well, if you got a system where you can make it work.
But you got to ask yourself a lot of tough questions about the social environment, the pollution of that environment, what happened to the evolutionary process there.
Theoretical economic understanding that informs the political process.
Let me just say something about that.
We don't have an economic system that allows us to do what we're capable of doing.
But let's not get all over the map. Let's just be very specific about whether we are fighting a war against terror or we should be dealing with a medical problem of deranged people doing terror, okay? Desperate people doing terror. If you use the medical model, then you would have to, and it requires a lot of hard work. For instance, let's take blowing up the World Trade Center. We would want to know who are those 15 Saudis to begin with, or the 2 Egyptians, or the, but I would like to know. I still don't know. I look through all the literature. I read everything. I find, who were those 15 Saudi? Now, maybe they didn't know they were going to die. Maybe they didn't know what it was all. Maybe they were used. But the fact is, I'd like to know what music did they listen to, what religion did they practice, what influences were brought to bear on them, what caused these people to end up being, in a way, inhuman, okay, sick, all right? And if you think about it in those terms, it's like trying to deal with gang violence in a city. If you think it's a war, and we got a war against these gang kids, you're not going to get anywhere. if you think of it as pathology, if you think about what would cause a kid to become a gang
it's like
kid,
a cancer.
Was it learning problems they had? Was it child abuse? Was it improper diet? Was it
all of the above? Or the
okay.
frustration of having a capability to provide for everyone that the system doesn't allow us to do, because we're not properly informed in terms of
what I'm saying is that
economic
it's particularly dangerous.
A change needed.
Right. So what I'm saying is particularly dangerous about this president. And again, I would take that Russert, NBC Meet the Press thing, because I think it exposed him maybe more than he's ever been exposed.
You mean who? The president or Russert?
The president.
Oh, okay.
Because what you saw was that the man could not deal with any issue other than with this war metaphor. He kept talking, I'm a wartime president. Our budget is influenced because we're at war.
Yeah, potential threat.
Yeah, but
the
whole language was about war. It wasn't about problem solving. It wasn't about deeper understanding.
Maybe getting at some of the things that caused the problem in the beginning, which are all these other lines.
So that is, to my mind, truly frightening.
And that passes as our leadership.
Yeah.
So we got a real problem. And this one you feel is even more difficult than was Vietnam. And remember the horror
sure,
of
but
that?
I've never known.
Just remember the horror of that.
No, but I've never known a leadership to be so cut off from alternatives. Look, let's take Vietnam. In the Johnson administration, we know you had the Les Gelbs doing the Pentagon paper study. We know you had Daniel Ellsberg's, breaking ranks. We know
even Washington Post publishing Times publishing the
according to McNamara now, he had
that could get cut off.
But he had big doubts.
Yeah, okay.
McNamara. So
apparently at the time.
So evidently there was, we know, I forget all the players, McNaughton or whatever, but there were all these people in there who were pulling it in different directions and arguing and challenging what was going on. You had the Rostows on one hand, and you had the more dovish people on the other, and I just don't see that in this administration. This administration, look, this guy, Treasury Secretary O'Neill, he's not some pinko lefty pacifist. He's a hard-headed businessman.
And that book is worth reading.
Hard-headed businessman. He's sitting there at his first National Security Council meetings and everything, and he looks around and he says, wait a minute, what are we talking about here? Iraq? And has everybody gone off the reservation? And, and we're talking about these tax cuts to help the rich, and that's what, and here was, he was the head of Alcoa.
I know.
Was not some,
well,
woolly-headed liberal fellow. And what they do, they now have described him as somebody, as a wacko.
Listen, we only got just started talking. James Joyce said history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken. Maybe we need an alarm clock or something to awaken to the crisis. It really is a gathering crisis and a real one. And the book, once again, really quick, we got to let them know, the 5 biggest lies that Bush told us about Iraq is written, co-authored by Robert Scheer, our immediate guest here, and his son, who was largely responsible, Christopher Scheer, a very enlightened young man coming along, and we want to thank you and recommend one and all to get it. And Bob Scheer, thanks very much for everything and for coming in. It's been your pleasure to have his perceptions.
I'm sorry I interrupted as much.
I'm sorry I interrupted you so much. Anyway, your pleasure to have the perception of the legendary, if I may so, Bob Scheer. He writes for the New York Times. Now you can see him.
L.A. Times.
L.A. Times, L.A. Times. But a major person that you have repaired to in order to get a sense of how we might more rationally operate this spaceship Earth of ours. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. Until next week, and Bob Scheer, once again, thanks very much for coming. Great pleasure. So the problem is you always run out of time. There's too much to talk